My name is Sophronia Milcah, and I am 29 years old. Last Tuesday, at a dinner that was supposed to celebrate my promotion to Vice President of Logistics, my younger sister clutched her chest and collapsed onto a Persian rug. She did it because she could not handle my parents paying attention to me for 5 minutes. My parents blamed my bragging for giving her a heart attack and rushed her out into a freezing Boston snowstorm, leaving me behind. When I finally fought my way to the emergency room at Mass General, my parents were demanding VIP treatment from the chief attending trauma physician. What they did not know was that the doctor they were screaming at, the man who was about to clinically expose my sister's fake coma, was my fiancé, and he was about to end their perfect Boston elite facade. Before I tell you exactly what he said to shatter their pride, please hit the like and subscribe button for Sophia Told Stories. Let me know in the comments how old you are and what city you are watching from right now. Now let me take you back to that freezing November evening in Beacon Hill, to the dining room, where my family made it clear I was just a background character in my sister's life. The wind was howling off the Charles River, rattling the tall windows of my parents' historic brownstone. Inside the dining room was warm, smelling of roasted lamb and expensive red wine. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table. I had just received an email confirming my promotion at a top-tier biotech firm, bringing my salary to $180,000. This dinner was ostensibly in my honor. My father, Richard, stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. He cleared his throat and looked down the table. He said he was proud of my little desk job. Then, without taking a breath, he pivoted. He turned his beaming smile toward my 26-year-old sister, Vanessa. He raised his glass higher and proposed a toast to Vanessa reaching 10,000 followers on her lifestyle page. Vanessa smiled and flipped her hair. She lived rent-free in a luxury apartment funded entirely by my parents. She had never held a real job. My mother, Patricia, reached over and patted Vanessa on the hand, agreeing that building a personal brand was far more demanding than corporate logistics. I did not argue. I just kept my face neutral and slid my hand under the table. I pulled out my phone and typed a quick text to Julian. Julian Sterling was 36 years old. He was a brilliant trauma attending at Mass General Hospital. We had been quietly engaged for 3 months. I kept his true status a secret from my family. I told them he was a mid-level clinic administrator. I knew that if my parents found out he was a top-tier Boston surgeon, they would obsess over his status. Worse, Vanessa would view him as a prize to be stolen. Julian texted back immediately, telling me to breathe and that he would see me after his shift. I smiled at the screen and put the phone away. The conversation around the table shifted. My Aunt Helen leaned forward and asked me to explain what a vice president of logistics actually does. She seemed genuinely interested in my new title. I opened my mouth to answer. Vanessa realized the spotlight was drifting away from her. I watched her eyes dart around the room. She looked at our aunt, then at me, and her breathing hitched. Vanessa let out a sharp gasp. She slumped sideways in her chair, dragging the tablecloth with her. She slid down toward the floor in a dramatic faint. But my logistics training makes me notice details. As Vanessa fell, she kept her right arm perfectly rigid. She caught her designer wine glass just before she hit the floor, ensuring the expensive Cabernet did not spill on her silk dress. My mother screamed. The sound of my mother shrieking shattered the quiet warmth of the dining room. Heavy oak chairs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. My father dropped his linen napkin directly into his water glass, knocking it over as he sprinted around the mahogany table. He dropped to his knees beside Vanessa. I stood up immediately. My hands reached out, conditioned by years of family duty, to offer assistance. I took 2 steps forward before Patricia shoved me backward. Her hands hit my shoulder hard enough to knock me off balance. She ordered me to get back and stop crowding her baby. I caught my footing against the edge of the table and stared down at the floor. Vanessa lay there with her eyes closed, breathing in shallow, performative hitches. Beside her right hand, the fragile stem of the designer wine glass rested safely on the carpet. Not a single drop of dark red liquid had spilled onto her silk dress. The physics of a genuine collapse dictate chaos and loss of motor control. Hands open, objects shatter. Vanessa had orchestrated a highly controlled descent. Richard scooped my sister into his arms. He grunted under her weight, shouting at my mother to get the front door. The heavy wooden door swung wide open, letting the brutal Boston winter storm tear into the heated hallway. I grabbed my wool coat off the rack, threw it over my shoulders, and followed them out onto the freezing brick steps. The wind cut through my thin silk blouse instantly. Snowflakes stung my cheeks like tiny needles. Richard kicked open the back door of his heated luxury SUV. He laid Vanessa carefully across the pristine leather seats. Patricia climbed in right beside her, stroking her hair and sobbing loudly into the dark night. I reached for the passenger door handle, intending to ride with them. Richard spun around and slammed his palm against the frozen metal, locking the door. He looked me dead in the eye. He stated there was no room for me in the car. He told me to drive myself. Before turning his back, he snapped his fingers in my face. He ordered me to go back inside, find her premium insurance card on the dinner table, and bring it to the hospital. He slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life. The heavy tires spun on the icy driveway, spitting dark sleet onto my boots. I stood there alone, shivering, as the red taillights vanished into the blinding white snow. I turned back toward the empty house. The silence inside the dining room felt heavier than the howling wind outside. I found the insurance card sitting exactly where Vanessa had left it, next to her untouched dessert plate. I picked up the small plastic rectangle, feeling its sharp edges. I walked back out into the freezing night and climbed into my own sedan. The engine turned over with a sluggish groan. The heater struggled, blowing icy air against my numb fingers. Pulling out onto the street, the visibility was near zero. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, covering the historic street lamps. Driving down Storrow Drive required immense physical focus. The tires slipped on the black ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. Every shadow shifting in the storm looked like a potential hazard. The windshield wipers scraped a frantic rhythm against the accumulating ice. The physical isolation inside my freezing car perfectly mirrored the reality of my existence in this family. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the cold leather bite into my palms. My mind shifted gears. The panic they wanted me to feel evaporated into the winter air. My professional training took over. In the world of corporate logistics, you solve complex problems by tracing the chain of events backward to find the root cause of a system failure. You look for patterns instead of reacting to emotions. You analyze the variables to understand the outcome. I started running a mental audit on the data points of the evening. Data point 1 was the arrival of my promotion email, a top-tier corporate salary, and a vice president title threatening the established family hierarchy. Data point 2 was the conversation shifting away from Vanessa's trivial social media milestones. Data point 3 was the sudden onset of critical medical symptoms precisely timed to interrupt my aunt asking a direct question about my career trajectory. Data point 4 was the rigid arm muscle control required to save the wine glass from breaking. When you map those specific points on a timeline, the trajectory becomes unmistakable. It was not a spontaneous medical crisis. It was a strategic extraction of attention. It was a calculated maneuver designed to hijack the evening and reestablish Vanessa as the sole priority. As a logistics expert, I recognize a recurring operational defect when I see one. A review of historical data confirmed the trend. A sprained ankle appearing precisely on the morning of my college graduation. A sudden migraine developing the exact hour I needed help moving into my first apartment. The variables changed, but the system output remained identical. My parents rewarding her behavior was the expected outcome of a corrupted process. I kept the hazard lights blinking, guiding my sedan slowly over the Longfellow Bridge. The Charles River below was a frozen black void, reflecting nothing. My phone lit up in the center console, cutting through the dark interior of the car. The screen flashed with my mother's name. I pressed the speaker button, keeping my eyes fixed on the treacherous road ahead. Patricia did not ask if I was safe driving on the icy roads. She did not ask if my car heater was working, or if I could see through the blizzard. Her voice echoed through the car speakers, demanding to know my exact estimated time of arrival. She yelled that the triage nurses needed the physical insurance card and that I was moving far too slowly. She claimed Vanessa needed a private, luxury room right now, and my selfishness was causing her daughter undue suffering. I listened to her voice crack with performative anxiety. I realized she did not view me as a daughter driving through a dangerous storm. She viewed me purely as administrative support for Vanessa's theatrical life. I was a courier, tasked with delivering a piece of plastic so her favorite child could secure the best hospital bed in the city. The cold air inside my car felt fitting. The warmth of family loyalty had never applied to me. I stared at the taillights of a snowplow in the distance. I told her I was 10 minutes away. I did not apologize for the delay. She hung up without saying goodbye. The line clicked dead, leaving me alone with the sound of the heater finally pushing warm air into the cabin. I took a deep breath, letting the facts settle into my logical brain. I was driving toward Mass General Hospital. I was heading straight into a facility equipped with state-of-the-art diagnostic machines and highly trained medical professionals who deal in empirical facts rather than familial manipulation. My family expected to walk into that building and dictate reality, just like they did in their Beacon Hill dining room. They expected the hospital staff to bow to their demands and validate their theatrics. I steered the car down the off-ramp toward the hospital complex. The bright red emergency signs cut through the white snowstorm like warning beacons. I navigated the slippery turns of the parking structure, finding a spot near the elevators. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet dark for a brief moment. I knew something they did not know. I knew who was running the trauma floor tonight. I pulled the keys from the ignition and gripped the insurance card in my pocket. I walked out into the freezing wind, moving toward the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. I was ready to watch their manufactured crisis collide with the cold, hard truth of modern medicine. The automatic sliding doors of Mass General Hospital parted. The blast of warm air smelled of harsh antiseptic and melting snow. The emergency room operated as a coordinated symphony of authentic human suffering. Paramedics rushed stretchers down the bright linoleum corridors, shouting shorthand codes to waiting trauma teams. Exhausted nurses barked sharp orders regarding blood pressure drops and head injuries caused by the treacherous nor'easter outside. Real people were bleeding and fighting for their lives. In the dead center of this high-stakes environment, my parents were treating the triage desk like the concierge counter at a disappointing luxury hotel. I could hear my father's voice echoing across the waiting area before I even cleared the security detectors. Richard stood, towering over a seated intake nurse, jabbing his index finger toward her keyboard. He demanded immediate access to the chief of staff. He loudly listed his corporate real estate credentials and his tax bracket, acting as if high net worth could somehow cure a biological failure. Patricia stood right beside the triage gurney where Vanessa lay motionless. My mother was weeping loudly, but her eyes darted, constantly assessing the surrounding room to ensure she had an adequate audience for her performance. I walked forward, my winter boots squeaking against the wet floor. I extended my hand, offering the premium platinum insurance card to the exhausted triage nurse. Patricia snapped her head toward me. Her weeping stopped in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated contempt. Patricia stepped away from the gurney and closed the distance between us. She hissed that I took my sweet time getting there. I did not mention the treacherous sheets of black ice on Starrow Drive, or the near-zero visibility of the blizzard. I merely stated the insurance card was delivered. My mother leaned in close so only I could hear the venom dripping from her words. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She stated that my arrogant bragging at the dinner table caused this tragedy. She claimed Vanessa possessed a highly fragile nervous system, and that parading my new vice president title around the dining room triggered a catastrophic physiological stress response. According to Patricia, I was not just a negligent sibling. I was the literal architect of Vanessa's sudden heart failure. I did not waste my breath defending myself. Defending yourself against an irrational accusation only validates their broken premise. Instead, I shifted my gaze past my mother's angry face and looked directly at the portable vitals monitor hooked to Vanessa's index finger. As a logistics professional, I trust hard numbers over emotional narratives. The glowing green digits displayed a resting heart rate of 72 beats per minute. The bright blue text showed a pristine oxygen saturation level of 99%. A human body undergoing a genuine cardiac event or a stress-induced medical coma does not produce the textbook vitals of a sleeping marathon runner. Vanessa was resting quite comfortably under the fluorescent lights. The only actual exertion happening in that bay was my parents' exhausting effort to maintain their manufactured illusion. Standing there, absorbing my mother's toxic blame, I thought about my college boyfriend, Mark. 7 years ago, I brought Mark home to a family Thanksgiving dinner. He was a kind young man studying civil engineering. My parents spent the entire evening pointing out his perceived flaws, comparing his state university education to the Ivy League pedigree they felt our family deserved. Then Vanessa stepped in to finish the job. She played the fragile victim, claiming Mark made her feel profoundly uncomfortable with a single misinterpreted glance across the table. By the end of the night, my parents demanded I break up with him immediately to protect family harmony. They systematically dismantle anything that brings me joy if it threatens to elevate my status above my sister. That is the exact reason Julian remained a carefully guarded secret. I knew if Richard and Patricia discovered I was engaged to a man of his elite caliber, they would stop at nothing to sabotage the relationship. Or worse, they would try to manipulate Julian into serving Vanessa's endless needs. They would treat his medical degree like a family asset to be exploited. Richard slammed his heavy palm on the triage counter again, making the plastic trays jump. He informed the charge nurse that he would be contacting the hospital board of directors first thing in the morning to report her gross incompetence. The nurse typed methodically on her computer, ignoring his bluster with practiced grace. She stated in a flat monotone that a doctor would evaluate the patient shortly, but severe trauma victims pulled from the blizzard took priority over stable arrivals. Richard turned a deep shade of purple. He grabbed his phone and threatened to call the mayor. Patricia returned to her weeping routine, clutching Vanessa's limp hand and loudly praying for a miracle. The sheer audacity of their theater in a room filled with actual bleeding victims made my stomach twist into knots. I stepped back from the screaming match, retreating toward the edge of the trauma bay. I needed to distance myself from the spectacle before I lost my temper. As I turned my head toward the main surgical corridor, the heavy double doors swung open. A group of young residents in light blue scrubs walked through, furiously taking notes on their digital tablets. At the center of the group, walking with a calm, commanding stride, was Julian. He wore his dark navy scrubs and a crisp white coat. A stethoscope hung loosely around his neck. His expression was a mask of pure clinical focus. He was giving rapid-fire instructions regarding a multi-vehicle pileup out on Interstate 93. He looked exactly like what he was, the ultimate authority in the building. He commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. It was the exact type of genuine power my father spent his entire life pretending to possess. He was 50 feet away and closing the distance fast. My parents had their backs to him, entirely consumed by their own drama. My pulse accelerated. The two worlds I had kept meticulously separated for months were seconds away from a brutal collision. I knew Richard's playbook by heart. If Julian walked up to this bed as a stranger, my father would treat him like a hired servant. He would insult him, question his credentials, and demand subservience. Patricia would attempt to manipulate his sympathy using fake tears and fabricated medical histories. I could not let Julian walk into their trap blind. I reached deep into my wool coat pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers were still stiff from the freezing steering wheel, but I managed to unlock the screen. I opened my encrypted message thread with Julian. I did not have time to explain the complex psychological warfare of the Milcah family. I needed to give him a tactical heads-up right now. I typed 3 rapid sentences. My family is here. They are at Triage Bay 4. Brace yourself, because they are out for blood. I hit send. I looked up just as Julian's phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He pulled it out without breaking his confident stride. He read the glowing screen. His footsteps slowed for a fraction of a second. He lifted his head, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the chaotic emergency room until they locked directly onto mine. The heavy plastic curtains of Triage Bay 4 rustled loudly as my father turned around, ready to unleash his fury on whoever dared to approach his precious daughter. The heavy plastic curtains of Triage Bay 4 swept open. Dr. Julian Sterling stepped into the cramped space. He carried a digital tablet in his left hand and an aura of absolute command in his posture. The ambient noise of the emergency room seemed to dull the moment he crossed the threshold. 2 exhausted triage nurses instinctively stepped back, giving him a wide berth. My father, Richard, spun around. His face was flushed, a deep, mottled red from his earlier screaming match. He squared his shoulders, pulling himself up to his full height. Richard was accustomed to intimidating subordinates in corporate boardrooms. He used his physical size and his expensive tailored overcoat as weapons of compliance. He took one aggressive step toward the doctor, preparing to unleash a barrage of elite entitlement. Richard did not offer a greeting. He launched directly into a list of uncompromising demands. He stated that his daughter was suffering a catastrophic cardiac event. He demanded an immediate transfer to a private luxury suite on the upper floors. He required a full panel of magnetic resonance imaging and a team of specialized cardiologists. He dropped the names of 2 hospital board members he golfed with at his exclusive country club. He finished his tirade by jabbing his finger in the air and stating that any delay in premium care would result in a devastating lawsuit that would end the career of everyone standing in that room. Julian did not flinch. He did not blink. He did not even look at my father's face. The doctor simply tapped the screen of his digital tablet, scrolling through the intake notes with slow, deliberate movements. This reaction was entirely alien to my father. In Richard's world, silence was a sign of weakness, but in the high-stakes environment of a trauma center, silence is the ultimate display of authority. Julian was an apex predator in this sterile ecosystem. I watched from the corner of the bay, feeling a quiet thrill course through my veins. I knew Julian's pedigree intimately. He graduated at the top of his class from Harvard Medical School, but he was raised in a tough, working-class neighborhood in South Boston. He spent his formative years dealing with actual street-level threats before climbing the academic ladder of the medical elite. He was entirely immune to the bluster of Beacon Hill old money. He ate arrogant billionaires for breakfast. Julian tapped the screen one final time and locked the tablet. He lifted his dark eyes and looked past my father. He focused his attention directly on the glowing monitors positioned above the hospital bed. The green and blue lines traced a perfect rhythmic pattern across the dark screen. Patricia decided to deploy a different tactic. Where Richard used aggression, my mother utilized weaponized victimhood. She stepped forward, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. She reached out, attempting to place her hand on Julian's forearm to establish a false sense of intimacy. She wept softly, claiming her precious youngest daughter possessed a highly delicate constitution. She spun a fabricated narrative about a lifelong struggle with mysterious fainting spells that no doctor had ever been able to cure. She pleaded with him to save her baby from this terrifying coma. Julian sidestepped her touch with a smooth, clinical pivot. He did not offer a comforting smile. He did not offer words of false hope. His voice was a low, even baritone that carried easily over the beeping machinery. He requested that both parents take 3 steps back toward the privacy curtain to allow for an unimpeded neurological assessment. He stated that proximity compromised the sterile field and interfered with his diagnostic protocol. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer, icy professionalism in the doctor's tone froze the words in his throat. Grumbling under his breath, my father grabbed my mother's elbow and pulled her back. They stood shoulder to shoulder, radiating indignant fury. Julian approached the edge of the narrow hospital bed. Vanessa lay perfectly still. Her eyelids were shut tight. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. To an untrained observer, she looked like a tragic victim of a sudden biological failure. To a seasoned medical professional, she looked like an amateur actress giving a highly flawed performance. Julian reached out and gently pressed his stethoscope against her chest. He listened for exactly 4 seconds. He checked the pulse point on her wrist. He did not speak a word to her. He did not try to wake her up with loud verbal commands. In the field of logistics, you do not ask a failing system to diagnose itself. You run a stress test designed to expose the hidden mechanical flaw. Julian was about to run the ultimate biological stress test. He moved to the side of the bed, positioning himself right next to Vanessa's resting shoulder. He reached down and grasped her right wrist. He lifted her forearm straight up into the air. He held her arm completely vertical, suspending her limp hand directly over her own face. The room grew incredibly still. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic chirping of the heart monitor. I held my breath. I knew exactly what this procedure was. It is a fundamental neurological assessment used in trauma wards across the globe. It relies on a principle that cannot be faked or bypassed by human willpower. It relies on the deepest, primal instinct of self-preservation. If a patient is genuinely unconscious, lacking all voluntary motor control, gravity will take over the moment the arm is released. The hand will drop like a dead weight and strike the patient squarely in the face. A comatose brain cannot send a signal to intercept the falling limb. But if a patient is merely pretending to be asleep, the primitive survival center of the brain will override the performance. The brain will refuse to allow the body to intentionally smash its own nose. Julian held her wrist suspended in the bright fluorescent light for 3 agonizing seconds. He looked over his shoulder, making direct eye contact with my father. Then he let go. Vanessa's arm plummeted downward, driven by the unforgiving force of gravity. The trajectory was perfect. Her knuckles were on a direct collision course with the bridge of her nose. The distance closed in a fraction of a heartbeat. At the very last possible millisecond, the performance shattered. The tricep muscle in Vanessa's arm twitched with sudden, urgent tension. Her wrist rotated outward. Her hand swerved sharply to the left. The falling limb bypassed her face completely and landed with a soft thud against the pillow right next to her cheek. The silence in the trauma bay was deafening. The laws of physics and biology had just testified against my sister. The verdict was undeniable. Julian did not look surprised. A cold, knowing smirk curled the corner of his mouth. He picked up his digital tablet from the edge of the bed. He tapped the screen, unlocking the medical chart. He did not whisper. He projected his voice so it echoed clearly down the busy hospital corridor outside the plastic curtains. He dictated his findings to the attending nurse standing nearby. He stated the patient exhibits intact protective reflexes and perfectly normal vital signs. He declared the patient is fully conscious. He ordered the nurse to officially chart a factitious presentation and prepare the discharge paperwork immediately. The manufactured illusion of the Beacon Hill medical crisis evaporated into the sterile hospital air. My mother's fake tears vanished instantly. My father's jaw dropped open. He stared at Vanessa's hand resting safely on the pillow, unable to process the humiliation of the trap they had just walked into. The pristine facade of the perfect, wealthy family was cracking wide open under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the man holding the hammer was just getting started. The moment Julian's words hung in the air, Vanessa's eyes snapped open. The theatrical performance ended not with a gradual, groggy awakening, but with the sharp, terrified realization of a cornered animal. She scrambled backward on the hospital bed, pulling the thin cotton sheet up to her chin. The heart monitor beeped in a steady, rhythmic cadence, exposing the absolute biological truth of her deception. She was healthy. She was conscious. She was caught. Richard reacted the only way he knew how when faced with undeniable reality. He escalated his aggression. He stepped into Julian's personal space, jabbing a thick index finger toward the doctor's chest. My father's face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. He bellowed that the diagnostic test was a barbaric assault on a delicate patient. He claimed Julian had intentionally traumatized his youngest daughter. He promised to unleash a legion of corporate attorneys on the hospital administration by dawn. He swore he would strip the arrogant clerk of his medical license and ensure he never worked in the city of Boston again. He demanded an immediate apology and the swift termination of everyone involved in this insulting charade. Julian did not flinch. He did not retreat. He did not raise his voice to match my father's decibel level. He smoothly reached down and buttoned the top button of his crisp white medical coat. He adjusted his stethoscope, ensuring the silver chest piece rested perfectly centered. He looked my father directly in the eye and delivered a masterclass in professional dismantling. Julian stated that a formal complaint required the submission of official paperwork to the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine. He generously offered to provide Richard with the exact forms required to initiate an investigation into the clinical protocols of the emergency department. He then suggested my father ensure he spelled the attending physician's name correctly on the legal documents. He stepped back and pointed to the black embroidered lettering above his breast pocket. Julian Sterling, M.D., Chief Attending Trauma Physician. The words landed like a physical blow. The air rushed out of my father's lungs. Richard was a man obsessed with hierarchy. In the ruthless social ecosystem of Beacon Hill, old money titles dictated worth. A mid-level clinic administrator was a target to be bullied. The chief attending trauma surgeon at Mass General was untouchable royalty. The power dynamic shifted violently in the space of a single heartbeat. The man Richard was threatening to destroy was the highest-ranking medical authority on the floor. Patricia audibly gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. She stared at Julian as if he had suddenly grown a second head. She had just spent the last 20 minutes performing a cheap melodrama for a man whose intellect and status far exceeded anything her family could command. The realization of her profound humiliation washed over her face, painting her cheeks a sickly shade of pale gray. Julian turned away from my stunned parents, dismissing them entirely. He walked toward the corner of the trauma bay where I was standing. The harsh, fluorescent lights caught the silver of his stethoscope. He closed the distance between us, his dark eyes softening with genuine warmth. He reached out and gently placed his hand on the small of my back. He leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. He looked back at Richard and Patricia, his voice carrying a calm, lethal precision. He added one final piece of information. He stated that he was also Sophronia's fiancé. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the realization fracture my parents' reality. The ultimate prize in their shallow, status-driven world was standing right in front of them. A highly respected, wealthy, brilliant surgeon. And he belonged to me. The daughter they systematically ignored. The daughter they treated as an unpaid administrative assistant. The daughter they had just abandoned in a blizzard to cater to a fake medical crisis. I had secured the exact type of alliance they had spent years trying to orchestrate for Vanessa, and I had done it without their permission, without their connections, and without their knowledge. Vanessa's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure jealousy. She clutched the thin hospital sheet, her knuckles turning white. The attention she had desperately tried to steal had been irrevocably handed to me. The spotlight was glaring, and it illuminated her profound failure. For 29 years, I had waited for my parents to validate my existence. I had worked grueling corporate hours to earn a promotion, hoping it would finally grant me a seat at their table. Standing in that trauma bay, looking at their paralyzed expressions, I realized a fundamental truth. A seat at their table was not a reward, it was a trap. Their approval was a poisoned chalice. I did not need it, I did not want it. I looked at my father, his shoulders slumped, his bluster entirely deflated. I looked at my mother, her hands trembling as she stared at the brilliant surgeon holding me close. I looked at my sister, sitting healthy and humiliated on the gurney. I set my first genuine boundary. I told them the show was over. I stated that the medical crisis had been officially debunked and I was going home. I advised them to settle the bill at the front desk. Julian nodded in agreement. He turned to the attending nurse and instructed her to process the discharge papers. He added a crucial logistical detail. He stated that because the presentation was factitious, the visit did not qualify as a medical emergency under standard diagnostic coding. He informed my parents that their premium platinum insurance policy would likely deny the claim. They would be personally responsible for the out-of-network emergency room fees. Julian squeezed my hand. We turned our backs on the stunned silence of the trauma bay. We walked through the heavy plastic curtains, leaving my family stranded in the harsh reality of their own making. We navigated the busy corridors of the emergency department, moving toward the sliding glass doors and the freezing Boston night. I felt lighter than I had in years. The heavy burden of seeking their approval had been lifted from my shoulders. But as the cold wind hit my face, I knew my family well enough to understand they would not accept defeat gracefully. Toxic systems do not self-correct, they escalate. And the weapon they chose next would not target my personal life. It would target the only other thing I valued, my career. The morning light filtering through my bedroom window was harsh and uninviting. I woke up feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace, having finally drawn a definitive line in the sand with my toxic family. That tranquility lasted exactly until I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The lock screen was completely illuminated. It was covered in dozens of unread notifications, an endless scroll of incoming texts, missed calls, and aggressive social media alerts. The messages were not expressions of concern regarding Vanessa's health. They were concentrated bursts of venom. My Aunt Helen sent a lengthy text accusing me of being a cold-hearted monster who abandoned her own flesh and blood during a cardiac crisis. A cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years left a voicemail calling me a corporate sociopath. The language was visceral and deeply personal. I sat up in bed, the cold Boston air creeping over the blankets as my logistics training kicked in. A sudden, highly coordinated influx of negative feedback across multiple communication channels indicated a central point of origin. I opened my social media applications to trace the source of the breach. Vanessa had not waited for morning to launch her counteroffensive. Before she even walked out of the Mass General lobby, she had deployed the weapon of her generation: digital assassination. Her profile glowed with a brand new uploaded video. The thumbnail was a carefully curated image of tragedy. She was sitting in the passenger seat of our parents' SUV, her face illuminated by the stark interior dome light. Her makeup was artfully smudged to suggest recent weeping. Her hair fell in perfectly disheveled waves. The video possessed the slick, overproduced quality characteristic of professional influencers. I pressed play. Vanessa's face filled the screen. She looked directly into the camera lens, her lower lip trembling with practiced vulnerability. She began speaking in a fragile, breathy whisper, explaining that she was recording this from the hospital parking lot because she feared for her life. She claimed she had suffered a terrifying, undiagnosed cardiac event during a family dinner. She spun a fabricated narrative, describing her desperate rush through the freezing blizzard while struggling to breathe. Then she initiated the targeted strike. She looked away from the lens, shedding a single, perfectly timed tear. She stated that when she finally reached the emergency room, she was met not with compassion, but with medical gaslighting. She alleged that the attending physician intentionally denied her supplemental oxygen and subjected her to a cruel, painful neurological test. She did not stop there. She wove my existence into her fabricated trauma. She claimed the corrupt doctor was dating her older sister. She painted a picture of a jealous sibling conspiring with a powerful medical professional to minimize her suffering because they could not stand her online success. She used all the correct psychological buzzwords designed to trigger algorithmic outrage. She spoke of toxic family dynamics, narcissism, and institutional abuse. The performance was chillingly effective. But the true danger lay in the metadata. Vanessa was a master of online manipulation. She understood how to weaponize hashtags and drive localized engagement. Directly beneath her tearful video, she had tagged the official accounts of Mass General Hospital. She tagged the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine. And with calculated precision, she tagged the corporate handles of my high-tier biotech firm. She framed the narrative to suggest that these prestigious institutions were harboring abusive and corrupt individuals. The video had been live for less than 8 hours. It had already amassed over 50,000 views. The comment section was a churning vortex of localized outrage. People from across the Boston metropolitan area were demanding accountability, tagging local news stations and demanding the immediate termination of the corrupt doctor and his cruel corporate girlfriend. The familial conflict had metastasized. It was no longer confined to the mahogany dining room in Beacon Hill. It had breached the containment protocols, crossing the line into public professional sabotage. I sat in the quiet of my apartment watching the view counter tick upward with terrifying speed. My parents had always utilized a strategy of containment when managing Vanessa's behavior. They enabled her demands behind closed doors, purchasing expensive gifts and subsidizing her lifestyle to keep her placated. They believed money could insulate them from the consequences of her profound entitlement. They had severely miscalculated. Vanessa's digital reach was extensive. She had spent years cultivating an audience hungry for drama and perceived injustice. Her followers were not interested in verified facts or clinical diagnoses. They were primed to attack the targets she designated. She had successfully directed a mob of thousands directly at my newly minted vice president title and Julian's elite medical career. I understood immediately that this was not merely a tantrum. It was a calculated attempt to destroy our livelihoods. Vanessa knew she could not compete with me in a corporate boardroom. She knew she could never match Julian's academic prestige. So she decided to drag us down into the chaotic arena she controlled, the arena of public opinion, where emotion always overrides evidence. My phone vibrated in my palm, breaking my intense focus. It was a text message from Julian. The notification banner flashed across the top of my screen. His message was brief and characteristically analytical. He stated that hospital administration had just contacted him regarding a viral incident and requested my immediate presence at his apartment. I threw off the heavy blankets, the adrenaline sharpening my senses. I moved through my morning routine with mechanical efficiency. I chose a tailored navy blazer and a crisp white button-down shirt. I dressed for a corporate battle, because that is exactly what this had become. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, stepping into the crisp morning air. The blizzard had passed, leaving the city buried under a thick layer of pristine white snow. The contrast between the beautiful winter morning and the digital inferno consuming my life was jarring. I drove through the plowed streets of Boston, heading toward Julian's building in the Back Bay. The radio played softly in the background, but I could not focus on the music. I was mentally preparing a defense strategy, calculating the potential fallout for my company and determining the legal parameters of defamation. When I arrived at Julian's high-rise apartment, he was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the frozen Charles River. He held 2 mugs of dark black coffee. He handed one to me, his expression serious but remarkably calm. He did not offer platitudes. He did not say everything would be fine. He dealt in empirical reality. He took a sip of his coffee and stated that my sister had initiated a highly effective asymmetrical warfare campaign. He informed me that the hospital's public relations department was currently in crisis mode, attempting to manage the influx of angry comments flooding their social media channels. The administration had suspended his clinical privileges pending an emergency review board hearing scheduled for that afternoon. I gripped the warm ceramic mug, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The hospital was reacting exactly as Vanessa intended. In the risk-averse world of modern medicine, optics often supersede clinical facts until an internal investigation can verify the truth. Julian was facing the very real possibility of losing his prestigious position because my sister decided to weaponize her internet following. I looked at Julian, the guilt threatening to overwhelm my logical processes. I had brought this destructive force into his carefully structured life. I opened my mouth to apologize, but he raised a hand, stopping me instantly. He set his mug down on the glass coffee table, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He stated firmly that apologies were strategically useless. He explained that we were dealing with an adversary who exploited emotional vulnerability. He advised me to compartmentalize my familial guilt and focus entirely on the tactical situation. He was right. Feeling sorry for the collateral damage would not stop the incoming fire. My phone vibrated again. I pulled it from my pocket, expecting another hateful message from a distant relative. Instead, the screen displayed an incoming call from the private corporate number of my biotech firm's head of human resources. The digital assassination attempt had successfully reached the highest levels of my professional world. I stared at the glowing screen, knowing that the conversation I was about to have would determine whether I kept my vice president title or became a cautionary tale of corporate scandal. I took a deep breath, swiped the green icon to accept the call, and prepared to step into the corporate guillotine. The drive from Julian's apartment in the Back Bay to my office in Cambridge took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing into a different universe. Kendall Square is the undisputed hub of American biotechnology. It is a neighborhood built on precision, empirical data, and billions of dollars in venture capital. The architecture reflects the culture. The buildings are sharp structures of glass and steel, housing minds that engineer cellular therapies and optimize global health supply chains. I parked my sedan in the underground garage. I carried a single cardboard box containing my personal items. I stepped into the polished chrome elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. I had earned the title of Vice President of Logistics through years of grueling dedication. I spent my 20s mapping international shipping routes, reducing organizational waste, and ensuring that temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals reached clinical trials without a single variable out of place. I built my career by controlling chaos. Yet as the elevator ascended, I was carrying the digital equivalent of a live grenade. The doors parted with a soft chime. The reception area of the executive suite was immaculate, featuring white marble floors and sweeping views of the frozen Boston Harbor. The silver plaque on the door of my new corner office bore my name, Sophronia Milcah, Vice President. I stepped inside the spacious room. The desk was a beautiful slab of dark mahogany. I placed my cardboard box on the smooth surface. I reached inside to pull out a framed photograph of Julian and me, taken during a weekend trip to Cape Cod. Before my fingers even brushed the glass frame, the sleek digital phone on my desk chimed. The red indicator light blinked. I picked up the receiver. It was the executive assistant for the leadership team. Her voice was clipped and devoid of the usual morning warmth. She informed me that Marcus Thorne, the head of human resources, requested my immediate presence in the primary boardroom. She added a detail that made the temperature in my office seem to drop. Elena Rostova, the chief legal counsel, was waiting with him. This was not a welcome meeting to celebrate my promotion. A sudden summons involving both human resources and the legal department is the corporate equivalent of an execution squad. I left the photograph in the box. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy blazer and walked down the long carpeted corridor. The silence in the executive wing felt heavy, oppressive, and thick with unspoken tension. I pushed open the frosted glass door of the boardroom. The room was vast and stark. Marcus sat at the head of the long conference table wearing a sharp gray suit. Una stood near the digital presentation board, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Neither of them offered a smile. Neither of them extended a hand in congratulations. Marcus gestured to the empty black leather chair directly opposite him. I took a seat, keeping my posture rigid and my expression neutral. Elena picked up a small remote control from the table. She pressed a single button. The large wall monitor mounted behind Marcus blinked to life. Vanessa's face filled the high-definition screen. It was the same fabricated story, the same tearful performance, playing on a loop. The audio echoed through the silent boardroom. My sister was speaking in her fragile, breathy whisper, claiming institutional abuse and medical gaslighting. Right below her chin, the digital tags were clearly visible. She had deliberately linked the official corporate handle of our biotech firm to her theatrical trauma. Marcus folded his hands on the polished wood. He spoke with the practiced, measured cadence of a corporate fixer evaluating a broken asset. He acknowledged my exceptional operational record. He praised my proven ability to restructure failing supply chains and streamline international shipping protocols. Then he smoothly shifted the focus to the brutal reality of the Massachusetts biotech industry. He explained that in their sector, reputation is the most valuable currency. The company deals in public trust, ethical medical practices, and highly sensitive regulatory approvals. Investors and board members do not tolerate scandal. A senior executive cannot be the subject of a viral digital mob accusing her of conspiring with a doctor to deny a patient oxygen. Ine stepped forward, outlining the legal and public relations exposure. She stated that the company brand could not remain associated with a trending hashtag demanding accountability for alleged toxic manipulation. They did not view this as a tragic family dispute. They viewed my sister as a critical liability, and by extension, they viewed me as the source of that risk. Marcus delivered the ultimatum. His timeline was precise and unforgiving. He granted me exactly 48 hours to resolve the crisis. Within that narrow window, I was required to produce a verifiable public retraction from the original source. The video had to be permanently deleted from all platforms. A formal apology had to be issued, clearing my name and explicitly untangling the corporate brand from the controversy. If I failed to secure this retraction by Friday morning, the board of directors would require my immediate resignation. Elena clarified the terms. They would frame my departure as a mutual parting of ways to pursue other opportunities, preserving a shred of dignity for the public record. But the reality was undeniable. My career, my newly minted title, my equity shares, and my financial independence all hung on a ticking clock. I looked away from Marcus and stared at the frozen image of my sister on the wall monitor. The true nature of my parents' strategy crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. This was not a random emotional outburst. Richard and Patricia knew exactly what they were doing when they allowed Vanessa to post that video and tag my employer. My father was a corporate real estate developer. He understood the fragile optics of the Boston business world better than anyone. For decades, my parents had utilized guilt, silent treatment, and emotional withdrawal to control my behavior. When I stopped responding to those tactics, they decided to upgrade their arsenal. They were utilizing direct economic sabotage. They were actively willing to destroy my livelihood, erase my autonomy, and ruin my professional reputation, all to protect Vanessa's fragile ego. They wanted to force me back into submission. They calculated that if I lost my high-paying job and my prestigious title, I would be humiliated. They assumed a scandal would isolate me, leaving me vulnerable and dependent. They wanted me to crawl back to Beacon Hill asking for their help so they could resume their roles as the benevolent saviors, while keeping me firmly beneath my sister in the family hierarchy. Corporate executives do not care about childhood trauma. They do not factor narcissistic parenting into their risk assessments. They only care about mitigating liabilities and protecting the shareholder value. I did not waste my breath begging for understanding. I did not attempt to explain the complex psychological warfare of the Milcah family to Marcus and Elena. I looked Marcus directly in the eye. I nodded once. I accepted the terms of the ultimatum. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the boardroom. The countdown had officially begun. I returned to my corner office and closed the heavy wooden door behind me, listening to the latch click into place. I walked over to the mahogany desk, but I did not unpack the cardboard box. I did not look at the photograph of Julian. I sat down in my new leather chair and opened my laptop. A vice president of logistics knows how to track hidden variables. She knows how to audit a failing system and identify the weakest structural point. If my family wanted to wage a war of attrition, I would not fight them with emotions or angry text messages. I would fight them with raw, unfiltered data. I opened a secure browser window. I navigated away from the social media algorithms and bypassed the viral outrage. I logged into the state public records database. I began pulling the municipal property deeds, banking histories, and corporate registration filings associated with Richard Milcah. My parents built their entire identity on the illusion of untouchable wealth. It was time to audit the foundation of their empire. My new corner office was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. The 48-hour deadline issued by Human Resources hung in the air like a pendulum. In the logistics sector, you do not survive a supply chain failure by panicking or reacting to emotional threats. You survive by mapping the exact origin of the fracture. You follow the raw data until the hidden truth reveals itself. I opened my laptop and bypassed the internal corporate network. I logged directly into the Massachusetts Secretary of the Commonwealth database. My father projected the image of a Beacon Hill aristocrat. He wore bespoke suits and spoke of his commercial property portfolio as if he owned half the eastern seaboard. But true institutional wealth does not require constant validation. People who actually possess 9-figure bank accounts do not scream at triage nurses to prove their worth. I initiated a search query using Richard's legal name and his primary business addresses. The screen populated with dozens of results. He operated a convoluted network of holding entities designed to obscure true ownership. It took me over an hour to map the structural hierarchy of his businesses, transferring the data points into a visual flowchart on my secondary monitor. Most of the entities were standard commercial holdings tied to unremarkable office parks. Then a specific corporate designation caught my eye. It was a limited liability company named VM Holdings. The registered address was not a commercial property. It was a residential address located in the Seaport District. It was the exact street number and unit of Vanessa's luxury apartment. I requested the public incorporation filings and the associated debt instruments for VM Holdings. The digital progress bar crawled across my screen. When the encrypted file finalized, I opened the document. It was a commercial credit agreement drafted 6 years ago. The principal loan amount was staggering. It was structured to provide a continuous line of credit, drawing down thousands of dollars every single month. This was the hidden engine powering Vanessa's influencer aesthetic. Every designer handbag, every luxury vacation, every expensive dinner posted to her social media feed was financed by this single line of credit. I scrolled past the amortization schedules and the interest rate clauses. I reached the final page containing the notarized signatures. Richard was listed as the managing member. But commercial banks do not hand out 6-figure unsecured loans to shell companies without a personal guarantee. The bank required a primary guarantor, someone with verifiable income and a clean financial history to assume the ultimate risk. I looked at the signature line. The ink was digitized, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was my name. I stared at my own signature, feeling the temperature in my office drop. A memory surfaced from 6 years ago. I was 23 years old, working my first entry-level corporate job. I lived in a cramped studio apartment, struggling to pay my student loans. Richard invited me to a rare private lunch at his exclusive downtown social club. He bought me an expensive steak and smiled at me with a warmth he usually reserved for his wealthy clients. He slid a crisp folder across the white linen tablecloth. He told me it was a standard financial instrument designed to build my personal credit profile. He said he was utilizing his banking connections to help establish my financial future. He pointed to the dotted line. I wanted his approval so desperately that I signed the papers without reading the fine print. I signed away my financial autonomy for a rare moment of parental validation. He did not build my credit. He used my clean financial record as a human shield. He weaponized my trust to secure the capital required to fund his favorite child. I pulled up the specific terms of the credit agreement. It was an interest-only loan. This meant for 6 years, VM Holdings only paid the minimum monthly interest, while the principal balance remained untouched. But commercial interest-only loans carry a specific operational hazard. They contain a maturity date requiring a balloon payment. On a specific calendar day, the entire principal balance becomes due in one lump sum. I zoomed in on the maturity clause. The contractual deadline for the balloon payment was clearly printed in black ink, November 26th. I checked the digital calendar on my taskbar. November 26th was yesterday. It was the exact date of my promotion dinner. It was the exact night Vanessa clutched her chest and dramatically collapsed onto the dining room rug. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with sickening precision. The emergency room visit was never about petty jealousy over my new job title. Jealousy was merely a convenient emotional cover. It was a highly calculated tactical diversion. Richard knew the bank was preparing to collect the balloon payment. He knew the shell company did not possess the liquid capital to satisfy the debt. He knew that when the bank initiated collection procedures, they would bypass the empty corporate shell and come directly after the primary guarantor. They would come after me. My parents needed a smokescreen. They needed to manufacture a severe family crisis right as the financial bomb detonated. The plan was brilliant in its cruelty. By faking a catastrophic medical emergency, they intended to destabilize me emotionally. They wanted me drowning in guilt, terrified for my sister's life, and distracted by the chaos. When the bank inevitably froze my accounts and garnished my new vice president's salary, Richard would have framed himself as the victim of a banking error. He would have used Vanessa's fake illness to demand my compliance, forcing me to drain my own savings to protect the family during a time of medical tragedy. I leaned back in my leather chair. My pulse was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. They believed they had trapped me in an inescapable financial snare. They assumed the threat of bankruptcy combined with the viral social media scandal would break my spirit and force my surrender. They underestimated my profession. In logistics, whoever controls the supply chain controls the outcome. By making me the primary guarantor, Richard legally tethered my financial ruin to his own assets. The default clauses in the contract were standard. If the guarantor is forced to cover the debt, the guarantor legally acquires the right to seize the underlying collateral pledged by the managing member. Richard had pledged his primary residence to secure the line of credit. I was no longer a terrified 23-year-old seeking approval. I was a senior executive capable of dismantling a fraudulent enterprise. I closed the file and saved the documents to a secure, encrypted external drive. I possessed the exact ammunition required to execute a corporate kill shot. I could legally take their home. But a targeted strike requires coordinated timing. My family was fighting a two-front war. They were attacking my financial stability while simultaneously attempting to destroy Julian's medical career through public defamation. I could not launch my counteroffensive until I knew his flank was secure. I picked up my phone and opened my message thread with Julian. The hospital review board was currently interrogating him. I needed to know if his clinical reputation survived their digital assassination attempt before I burned their financial empire to the ground. I sat staring at the financial documents on my encrypted external drive. I held the power to seize my parents' home, but deploying that weapon prematurely could trigger a chaotic counterattack. I needed to ensure Julian's flank was secured before I initiated my strike. I minimized the banking records and opened a secure messaging application to contact him. His status indicator showed he was currently offline. He was likely sitting in a sterile administrative conference room defending his medical license against my father's fabricated accusations. The Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine does not take formal complaints lightly. Richard had leveraged his corporate connections to bypass the standard patient grievance process, ensuring his complaint landed directly on the desk of the hospital's chief medical officer. The allegation of intentional medical neglect, combined with the viral traction of Vanessa's video, created a volatile situation for Julian. Hospital administrations are notoriously risk-averse, preferring to suspend clinical privileges at the first sign of public controversy. Julian was facing a panel of his superiors, forced to justify his clinical judgment against an emotionally charged narrative. I paced the length of my corner office, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. I could not intervene in the medical inquiry. That arena belonged entirely to Julian. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the gray Boston skyline. The snow from the previous night was melting, turning the streets into a messy slush. My mind raced, analyzing the variables. If Julian lost his position, the financial leverage I held over my parents would feel like a hollow victory. I needed his reputation to emerge unscathed. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk, breaking my train of thought. It was a notification from a social media platform I rarely used. A former colleague from my previous logistics firm had forwarded me a link to a video. The attached message simply read, "You need to see this right now." I sat down and clicked the link. The application opened, bypassing Vanessa's original tearful performance and routing me to a different creator. The screen displayed a split frame. On the left side, Vanessa's video played silently. On the right side stood a woman wearing blue surgical scrubs and a stethoscope draped around her neck. Her username indicated she was a registered emergency room nurse in Chicago. She was conducting a brutal clinical teardown of Vanessa's narrative. The nurse paused the video on the left, freezing Vanessa's face in mid-sob. She picked up a digital stylus and circled Vanessa's cheeks. She explained that true hypoxia, a severe lack of oxygen, causes the skin to turn a distinct shade of pale blue or gray, particularly around the lips and nail beds. She pointed out that Vanessa's complexion was a robust, healthy pink, indicating perfect blood oxygen saturation. The nurse advanced the video a few seconds and paused it again. She zoomed in on the background of the shot, focusing on the portable vitals monitor visible just over Vanessa's shoulder. The numbers were slightly blurry, but the nurse sharpened the image. She read the data aloud, confirming the exact metrics I had observed in the trauma bay. A resting heart rate of 72 beats per minute and an oxygen saturation of 99%. She did not stop at the physiological evidence. She analyzed the performance. She pointed out the absence of genuine lacrimation, noting that Vanessa was wiping away invisible tears without a single drop of moisture disrupting her perfect makeup. She explained that the dramatic, breathy whispering was anatomically inconsistent with a patient experiencing a legitimate cardiac crisis. She concluded the analysis by stating definitively that the video was a textbook example of malingering, designed to manipulate public sympathy. The counterstrike was not isolated. I scrolled through the application, discovering that a massive organic movement had mobilized. The algorithmic outrage that initially fueled Vanessa's viral success had triggered a secondary wave of scrutiny from actual medical professionals. Dozens of doctors, nurses, and respiratory therapists from across the country were stitching her video. They were utilizing their clinical expertise to systematically dismantle her fabricated trauma. A board-certified cardiologist in New York posted a detailed breakdown of the neurological hand drop test, explaining the exact reflex Julian had utilized. He commended the attending physician for executing flawless diagnostic protocol under extreme pressure. A trauma surgeon in California criticized the patient for wasting valuable emergency room resources during a severe winter storm, emphasizing the danger her theatrics posed to real victims. The medical community had weaponized science against her digital defamation. They transformed her tearful plea into a clinical case study of fraudulent behavior. The public narrative shifted with violent speed. The comment sections, which hours ago had demanded Julian's termination, were now flooded with ridicule directed at Vanessa. Users were tagging her, calling her out for faking an illness for internet clout. They were demanding she apologize to the hospital staff she had slandered. The digital mob had turned on its creator. I watched the view counts on the debunking videos skyrocket. The clinical evidence was unassailable. Vanessa's carefully constructed illusion was collapsing under the weight of empirical scrutiny. The relief washed over me, relaxing the tight knot of tension in my shoulders. Julian did not need an expensive legal team to defend his clinical judgment. He had an army of medical professionals utilizing hard data to exonerate him in the court of public opinion. My phone rang, pulling my attention away from the screen. The caller identification displayed Julian's name. I answered immediately, the anticipation making my breath catch. His voice came through the speaker steady and remarkably calm. He informed me that the administrative inquiry had concluded. The panel of medical directors had reviewed the official intake chart, the raw vitals data, and the nursing logs from the previous night. They had also been made aware of the shifting public narrative driven by the medical professionals online. He explained that the hospital administration was no longer concerned about a public relations disaster involving his clinical conduct. They were, however, deeply concerned about the legal implications of my father's formal complaint. Richard had submitted a signed document alleging medical malpractice based on a demonstrably false narrative. In the state of Massachusetts, filing a fraudulent complaint with the medical board in an attempt to damage a physician's career is not a simple misunderstanding. It is a serious violation, carrying significant legal consequences. Julian stated that the hospital legal counsel was currently drafting a formal response to Richard, advising him of his exposure to a defamation lawsuit and potential criminal charges for filing a false report. The weapon my father had forged to destroy Julian had reversed direction and was now pointed directly at his own chest. Julian's clinical reputation was entirely secured. The hospital administration had fully reinstated his privileges, commending him for maintaining professional boundaries with a hostile and fraudulent patient. He was returning to his shift in the trauma ward. I ended the call feeling a profound sense of clarity. The board was perfectly aligned. My family had launched a coordinated assault intended to obliterate my career and Julian's medical standing. They had failed on both fronts. Vanessa's digital influence was currently being incinerated by clinical facts. Richard's attempt to manipulate the medical board had exposed him to severe legal jeopardy. They were disoriented and vulnerable. They believed they still held the ultimate leverage. Relying on the impending financial ruin they assumed the balloon payment would bring down upon me. They did not realize I had already audited their shell company and secured the documentation proving their fraudulent coercion. It was time to spring the trap. I opened my corporate email client. I composed a formal meeting invitation using the official letterhead of my biotech firm. I addressed it to Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa. I set the location as the primary executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. I selected a time precisely 24 hours from now. I did not threaten them in the email. I did not mention the balloon payment, the viral backlash, or the medical board complaint. I simply titled the calendar invitation, Settlement Mediation Regarding Ongoing Family Disputes. I knew my father's psychology. He would interpret the sterile corporate invitation as a white flag. He would assume the threat of human resources terminating my employment had broken my resolve. He would believe I was summoning them to beg for financial assistance and offer a humiliating apology to Vanessa in exchange for her deleting the video. His arrogance would compel him to attend. He would not be able to resist the opportunity to gloat in my own executive office. I hit send. The electronic invitation disappeared into the digital ether, ensuring my family would walk directly into the snare I had meticulously constructed. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The calendar invitation for a settlement mediation had been transmitted. Sending the electronic summons was merely the first tactical maneuver. Executing a successful corporate ambush requires flawless legal architecture. I could not face my father armed only with unverified downloads from a public database. I needed a predator who understood the ruthless mechanics of Massachusetts commercial law. I closed my laptop, grabbed my wool coat, and left my corner office. The walk through Kendall Square was bracing. The biting winter wind swept off the frozen Charles River, but the cold felt clarifying. I crossed the street toward a sleek, minimalist glass building housing the city's most feared corporate litigation firm. I had scheduled an emergency consultation with Elias Trent. Elias was a senior partner, specializing in hostile corporate takeovers and complex asset recovery. He did not build his reputation by negotiating polite settlements. He built his career by dismantling fraudulent enterprises with surgical precision. I was escorted into a stark, unadorned conference room. Elias did not keep me waiting. He walked in carrying a single yellow legal pad. He wore a dark, tailored suit and projected an aura of quiet, lethal intelligence. He did not offer warm pleasantries or ask about my day. He sat down, uncapped his fountain pen, and instructed me to outline the liability. I handed him the encrypted external drive containing the digital audit of my family. I did not waste his time with emotional anecdotes regarding my childhood or Vanessa's theatrical fainting spills. I presented the situation as a logistics failure. I explained the viral defamation targeting my biotech firm, the fabricated medical board complaint threatening Julian's medical license, and the hidden commercial credit line secured by a forged guarantor signature. Elias inserted the drive into his secure terminal. His eyes tracked across the screen, reading the corporate filings and the interest-only loan agreement with rapid comprehension. The silence in the room was dense, broken only by the soft clicking of his keyboard. He leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. He stated that my father had constructed a remarkably fragile house of cards. Elias bypassed the emotional betrayal and focused entirely on the statutory reality. He explained the legal doctrine of subrogation. In Massachusetts commercial real estate law, when a managing member defaults on a loan and triggers a fraudulent guarantor clause, the victim is not obligated to remain on the defensive. Elias clarified the mechanism. Because the balloon payment for VM Holdings matured and defaulted the previous day, the bank was preparing to execute a collection action. If I chose to assume the liability of that defaulted loan, utilizing my own executive compensation, I would not just clear the debt, I would legally purchase the debt. I would step into the shoes of the primary creditor. Richard had pledged the Beacon Hill brownstone as the underlying collateral for Vanessa's influencer credit line. He assumed that because I was his daughter, I would absorb the financial blow out of familial obligation, allowing him to retain his assets untouched. He failed to realize that by purchasing the defaulted note, I would acquire the direct legal authority to seize his collateral. I instructed Elias to prepare the paperwork. We were not drafting a standard cease and desist letter. We were constructing a financial guillotine. Elias began dictating instructions to his paralegal team. The first document was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose. It detailed the exact principal balance owed, the date of maturity, and the legal transfer of the debt subrogation. It explicitly identified the historic Beacon Hill property as the targeted asset for seizure. For decades, that brownstone had served as the physical manifestation of my parents' perceived aristocratic status. It was the stage where they hosted elite dinner parties and paraded their manufactured perfection. Stripping them of that property would not just cause economic ruin. It would result in permanent social erasure within their insular, wealthy circles. The second document addressed the ongoing digital sabotage. Elias drafted a comprehensive tort claim detailing the damages caused by Vanessa's viral video. He included the exact monetary value of my vice president compensation package and Julian's earning potential as a chief attending trauma physician. He combined those figures, establishing a baseline for a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit. He included a draft of a mandatory public retraction, scripting the exact words Vanessa would be legally compelled to read to avoid bankruptcy. The final document was the response to the medical board complaint. Elias pulled the official hospital records Julian had secured, highlighting the factitious presentation diagnosis. He attached the state statutes regarding the felony classification of filing false reports to a governing medical authority to extort a physician. I sat across from Elias, watching the printer generate the thick stacks of crisp, white paper. Each page represented a definitive boundary. Each signature line was a barricade protecting the life I had built. I gathered the heavy documents, sliding them into a dark leather portfolio. I thanked Elias for his ruthless efficiency. He offered a rare, brief smile, advising me to maintain a neutral expression during the mediation and let the paperwork do the bleeding. I walked back to my biotech office as the sun began to set over the Boston skyline. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the slush-covered sidewalks. When I returned to my desk, the digital indicator light on my phone was blinking. I opened my email client. A new message sat in my inbox. The calendar invitation for the settlement mediation had been updated. Richard Milcah had officially accepted the request. I stared at the green checkmark next to his name, analyzing the psychology behind his decision. My father was a man who operated entirely on arrogance and assumed superiority. He viewed my sterile corporate invitation as a signal of my total surrender. In his mind, the pressure of human resources and the threat of the viral scandal had successfully broken my spirit. He likely believed I was bringing them into my executive boardroom to offer a lucrative financial settlement, begging them to delete the video to save my job. He was eager to gloat. He wanted to sit in my new office and dictate the terms of my humiliation. I spent the evening meticulously preparing the boardroom. I arranged the chairs, ensuring I sat with my back to the sweeping harbor view, forcing them to face the blinding morning glare. I placed the leather portfolio in the exact center of the mahogany table. I reviewed the hospital records, the forged loan documents, and the foreclosure notices, memorizing the specific clauses and monetary figures. I did not feel nervous. I felt the cold, precise focus of a logistics director preparing to terminate a corrupted supply chain. The following morning arrived with a clear, freezing sky. The biotech facility hummed with its usual high-tech efficiency. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor boardroom, watching the tiny vehicles navigate the congested streets below. My tailored navy suit was immaculate. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. At precisely 9 o'clock, the sleek digital phone on the conference table chimed. I pressed the speaker button. The voice of the executive receptionist echoed through the spacious room. She maintained her professional tone, but I could hear the subtle strain of dealing with unreasonable guests. She announced that Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa Milcah had arrived at the front security desk. She noted that they were currently demanding specialized espresso beverages and requesting a private executive escort to the upper levels. I instructed the receptionist to provide them with standard visitor badges and send them up unescorted. I ended the call and took my seat at the head of the table. I rested my hands flat on either side of the dark leather portfolio. The soft chime of the elevator bell echoed down the long, carpeted corridor. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom were about to swing open. The trap was armed, and the prey was walking directly toward the snare. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom glided open on their brushed steel tracks. My family walked into the room, radiating the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of insulated privilege. Richard led the procession, his tailored cashmere overcoat draped over his arm, signaling his intent to stay just long enough to extract his demands. Patricia followed close behind, her gaze sweeping critically over the expansive mahogany table and the high-definition monitors. She was already mentally cataloging the luxurious details of my workspace, likely calculating how to spin my success into a narrative about her exceptional parenting skills once the dust settled. Vanessa brought up the rear. She was dressed in an oversized designer sweater and dark sunglasses, maintaining the carefully curated aesthetic of a traumatized victim bravely facing her abuser. She clutched a large iced coffee from a premium chain, the plastic cup sweating against her manicured fingers. The sheer audacity of her performance in a room dedicated to hard data and empirical science was staggering. I remained seated at the head of the long table. The winter sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, forcing them to squint against the glare as they approached. I did not stand to greet them. I did not offer them coffee or point toward the array of ergonomic chairs. I watched them navigate the unfamiliar corporate territory, waiting for the silence to become uncomfortable. Richard did not disappoint. He bypassed the empty chairs and marched directly to the edge of the table, positioning himself directly opposite me. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished wood. His posture was designed to intimidate, a classic intimidation tactic he likely utilized on junior associates and hesitant contractors. He smiled, but the expression lacked any warmth. It was the smile of a predator admiring a trapped animal. He began the negotiation by deploying condescension. He stated that it was a profound disappointment to see a family matter escalate to this level of corporate formality. He claimed he was merely acting as a protective father, attempting to shield his youngest daughter from the harsh consequences of my reckless ambition. He spoke with the cadence of a generous benefactor, offering a lifeline to a drowning subordinate. I did not respond. I maintained my neutral expression, letting his words echo in the vast, silent room. In logistics, you learn that silence is a highly effective tool for exposing structural weaknesses. When a failing system is not met with immediate resistance, the flawed components naturally accelerate their own collapse. Richard interpreted my silence as capitulation. He reached inside his breast pocket and extracted a crisp, white envelope. He tossed it onto the center of the table, the heavy paper sliding across the polished mahogany until it stopped inches from my leather portfolio. He instructed me to open it. He stated that the envelope contained the solution to my current professional crisis. He claimed he had utilized his extensive legal network to draft a comprehensive agreement that would satisfy all parties and restore peace to the Milcah family. I picked up the envelope, recognizing the heavy stock paper favored by expensive downtown law firms. I slid the documents out, unfolding the pages. It was a multi-tiered non-disclosure agreement coupled with a civil settlement contract. The terms were breathtaking in their arrogance. The document required me to formally admit fault regarding Vanessa's medical emergency. It mandated my immediate resignation from my vice president position, citing a desire to focus on family healing. But the final clause was the true objective. The contract stipulated a mandatory financial transfer of $50,000 payable directly to Vanessa. Richard framed this extortion as a modest sum intended to cover her emotional distress and out-of-network medical expenses. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He stated that the moment the funds cleared and the document was notarized, Vanessa would delete the viral video and issue a brief statement claiming the situation was a tragic misunderstanding. Patricia nodded enthusiastically, supporting his extortionate demands. She added that $50,000 was a small price to pay to avoid the complete destruction of my professional reputation. She suggested I consider the payment an investment in my own future, reminding me that the Massachusetts biotech industry would not tolerate an executive embroiled in a public scandal involving alleged medical abuse. Vanessa finally spoke, lowering her designer sunglasses to peer at me over the rim. She claimed she did not want my money, but the emotional trauma I inflicted required tangible restitution. She stated her digital platform was dedicated to transparency and healing, and she could not ethically remove the video without securing justice for her suffering. They had laid their entire strategy bare. They had articulated a textbook definition of corporate extortion in the presence of the victim. They believed they were executing a masterful power play, entirely unaware of the surveillance protocols governing modern executive environments. I carefully placed the extortion demand back onto the table, aligning the edges precisely with the edge of the wood. I looked at each of them individually, committing their smug expressions to memory. My pulse was steady, a slow, rhythmic drumbeat measuring the final seconds of their perceived victory. I pressed a hidden button located beneath the edge of the conference table. A small red indicator light illuminated on the central speaker console, indicating the room was now actively recording. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, electronic recording requires two-party consent. Failing to secure verbal acknowledgement renders the audio inadmissible in legal proceedings. I cleared my throat, my voice carrying easily across the vast room. I stated clearly, for the official record, that this settlement mediation was being held in the primary executive boardroom of my corporate employer. I explicitly informed Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa that the entire proceeding was currently being recorded for internal human resources documentation and potential legal review. I asked them to clearly state their names and acknowledge their consent to the recording. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The arrogant smiles vanished, replaced by hesitant calculation. Patricia looked at Richard, her eyes wide with sudden apprehension. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the plastic iced coffee cup crinkling in her grip. Richard, however, possessed an ego too massive to recognize a trap, even when the steel jaws were actively closing around his ankle. He assumed the recording was merely a defensive maneuver designed to protect my employment status. He sneered, leaning closer to the central microphone. He stated his full legal name and loudly declared his consent. He then ordered Patricia and Vanessa to do the same, asserting that he had absolutely nothing to hide and welcomed a permanent record of my ultimate surrender. Patricia and Vanessa mumbled their consent, their voices devoid of their previous bravado. The red indicator light pulsed steadily, capturing their verbal acknowledgement. The legal perimeter was now completely secure. They had willingly stepped into the kill box, locking the door behind them. They had officially entered their extortion demand into a recorded corporate record. I reached for the dark leather portfolio resting in front of me. I unclasped the brass closure, the sharp metallic click echoing loudly in the silent room. I did not need to negotiate. I did not need to scream or hurl accusations. I possessed the raw, unfiltered data. I opened the portfolio and prepared to initiate the clinical dismantling of the Beacon Hill aristocracy. I unclasped the brass closure of my dark leather portfolio. The sharp metallic click echoed in the silent executive boardroom. Richard remained standing at the opposite end of the mahogany table, his posture rigid and expectant. Patricia sat nearby, her eyes darting between my unreadable expression and the thick stack of papers resting in front of me. Vanessa took a long, slow sip of her iced coffee, the plastic straw scraping loudly against the bottom of the cup. I did not rush the moment. In the field of logistics, timing is the critical component that separates a successful operation from a chaotic failure. I sifted through the crisp white pages, locating the specific file I needed. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the stack. The document bore the official blue and silver seal of Massachusetts General Hospital. I placed my fingertips on the top edge and slid it across the polished wood. The paper glided smoothly, stopping mere inches from my father's hands. I spoke for the first time since initiating the recording equipment. My tone was conversational, but devoid of any familial warmth. I instructed him to direct his attention to the second paragraph, highlighting the attending physician's diagnostic notes. Richard narrowed his eyes. He picked up the paper, holding it up to catch the bright winter sunlight streaming through the windows. His gaze scanned the dense medical terminology. I watched the confident smirk slowly evaporate from his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. I did not wait for him to process the information in silence. I recited the text aloud, ensuring the recording captured the clinical assessment for the corporate record. I stated that the patient presented with intact protective reflexes and textbook vital signs. I read the final medical conclusion, detailing a factitious presentation and deliberate malingering. I explained that in the eyes of the established medical community, his youngest daughter was not a tragic victim suffering a cardiovascular crisis. She was a documented fraud who fabricated a medical emergency. Richard threw the paper back onto the table. The sheet fluttered before landing flat against the wood. He scoffed, attempting to regain his dominant posture. He claimed the document was an obvious forgery, manufactured by my fiancé to cover up his own gross incompetence. He boasted that he had already submitted a formal grievance to the state medical board. He asserted that Julian would be stripped of his surgical license by the end of the month, and a single piece of fabricated hospital letterhead would not save either of our careers. The frosted glass doors at the far end of the boardroom clicked open. Elias Trent walked into the room. The senior corporate litigator moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man accustomed to dismantling empires before lunch. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a slim silver briefcase. Richard spun around, startled by the sudden intrusion. Patricia stiffened her hands, gripping the armrests of her ergonomic chair. Elias did not introduce himself immediately. He walked the length of the long conference table and took the empty seat to my right. He placed his briefcase onto the table, unlatching the locks with a sharp snap. He extracted a pristine manila folder. He looked at my father, his expression carved from granite. Elias stated that he served as primary litigation counsel for this biotech firm and was acting as joint representation for Dr. Julian Sterling. Richard opened his mouth to object, but Elias raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. The lawyer addressed the medical board complaint directly. Elias informed my father that the hospital administration had reviewed the emergency room security footage, the raw cardiac monitor data, and the overwhelming consensus of the medical professionals who had systematically debunked Vanessa's viral video online. He explained that the state medical board does not tolerate wealthy individuals utilizing their grievance process to settle personal vendettas or extract financial settlements. Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He cited the specific Massachusetts Penal Code regarding extortion and the filing of false reports to a state licensing authority. He stated clearly that submitting a fabricated claim to destroy a physician's livelihood in pursuit of financial gain constitutes a felony offense. He informed Richard that the hospital legal department was currently drafting a response advising him of his exposure to a defamation lawsuit and potential criminal prosecution. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense negotiation to sheer legal peril. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at the extortion contract he had demanded I sign, realizing he had just documented his own illicit demands on a recorded corporate audio file. Patricia interrupted, her voice trembling with rising panic. She argued that they were merely seeking justice for the traumatic hospital experience and requesting fair compensation for the exorbitant costs associated with Vanessa's emergency care. She claimed the hospital billing department had already started sending threatening notices regarding the outstanding balance. Elias turned his unblinking gaze toward my mother. He reached into his folder and retrieved a standardized billing document printed on pink and white triplicate paper. He slid it across the table toward Patricia. He explained the harsh reality of premium platinum healthcare policies. He stated that insurance providers operate on strict diagnostic codes determined by the attending physician. Because Julian's clinical assessment legally classified the visit as a fake emergency, the insurance company categorized the event as non-compensable psychiatric malingering. They denied the entire claim. Elias pointed a silver pen at the bottom line of the invoice. He read the final balance aloud. $12,000. That was the out-of-pocket cost for occupying a Level 1 trauma bay, demanding unnecessary diagnostic tests and wasting the valuable time of emergency medical personnel during a severe winter blizzard. Patricia stared at the printed total, her jaw hanging open. $12,000 for a fabricated fainting spell. Vanessa sat frozen in her chair. The plastic iced coffee cup slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the mahogany table with a loud thud, tipping onto its side. The dark brown liquid spilled across the polished surface, soaking into the sleeve of her oversized designer sweater and dripping onto the carpet. She did not even attempt to wipe it away. She pulled off her dark sunglasses, exposing eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. The digital stunt she orchestrated for Internet Cloud had just materialized into a severe financial penalty. Her viral video had not ruined my career. It had exposed her father to potential criminal prosecution and generated a crippling medical bill. The insulated, wealthy world where her actions carried zero consequences was disintegrating right in front of her eyes. Her carefully curated influencer aesthetic was falling apart, replaced by the harsh glare of real-world accountability. Richard stared at the spilled coffee dripping off the edge of the table. He was a wealthy real estate developer, but a sudden $12,000 liability was a painful, unexpected sting. Yet his lifelong arrogance continued to blind him to the true depth of his peril. He straightened his cashmere tie, attempting to salvage a fraction of his shattered dignity. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced his designer leather wallet. He tossed it onto the table next to the medical bill. He stated with forced bravado that he could write a check for the hospital invoice right now. He claimed he could hire a team of defense attorneys to tie up the extortion claims in court for a decade, ensuring Julian spent the rest of his career fighting subpoenas. Richard sneered, his lips curling into a cruel, familiar smile. He claimed I had executed a clever corporate trick by bringing a lawyer into the room, but I still lacked the capital to truly defeat him. He demanded I sign the non-disclosure agreement, promising to forget the entire ordeal in exchange for the original $50,000 demand. He believed his bank account was his ultimate shield. He assumed his financial reserves made him invincible against any threat I could manufacture. He had no idea his primary bank account was already bleeding out. He had no idea his shield had been shattered yesterday afternoon. I looked at Elias, who gave a barely perceptible nod. I reached back into my dark leather portfolio, preparing to sever my father's final lifeline and execute the ultimate logistical strike. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom remained sealed, holding the chaos within. Richard stood there with his designer wallet resting on the table, projecting an illusion of infinite capital. He wore the smug expression of a patriarch who believed a checkbook could erase felony exposure and silence any opposition. He assumed his financial reserves were an impenetrable fortress. He did not realize I had already audited the foundation of that fortress and found it built on stolen credit. I did not touch his wallet. I let it sit there, looking small and insignificant against the vast expanse of polished mahogany. I turned my attention back to the dark leather portfolio. Elias sat beside me, his posture relaxed but vigilant, watching the precise moment the prey realized the snare was inescapable. I reached inside the folder and extracted the final stack of documents. These pages were thicker, printed on heavy legal stock and bound with a brass clasp. I slid the packet across the smooth wood. It came to a rest directly over his extortion demand, covering the non-disclosure agreement he had tried to force upon me. I instructed Richard to read the header on the first page. He glared at me, refusing to break eye contact. He picked up the packet with rigid fingers. His eyes darted down to the bold black text printed across the top margin. He read the words silently. His jaw tightened. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and ancient. I spoke clearly, ensuring the central microphone captured every syllable for the corporate record. I stated the name of the entity, VM Holdings. At the sound of those letters, Vanessa gasped. She dropped her hands to her lap, her posture shrinking. She knew that acronym. It was the financial engine that powered her entire existence. I laid out the empirical data without raising my voice. I detailed the origin of the commercial credit line established 6 years ago. I described the interest-only structure that allowed my father to draw down thousands of dollars every month to subsidize a luxury apartment in the Seaport District, designer wardrobes, and premium social media campaigns. I stripped away the glamorous facade of Vanessa's influencer lifestyle, exposing it as a debt-fueled fiction. Then I addressed the fundamental flaw in his design. I explained the mechanics of the maturity clause. I stated the exact date the balloon payment became due, November 26th. Patricia looked confused. She turned to Richard, her brow furrowed. She asked him what a balloon payment meant and why I was bringing up a date from 2 days ago. I answered the question for him. I told my mother that November 26th was the exact evening we gathered in the dining room to celebrate my promotion. It was the exact night The bank expected a lump sum wire transfer to satisfy the entire principal balance of the loan. It was the exact night Vanessa conveniently faked a cardiac event to hijack the narrative and distract everyone from the impending default. Richard remained silent. His knuckles were white, gripping the edges of the legal packet. I continued tracing the supply chain of his fraud. I brought up the private lunch at his downtown social club. I reminded him of the crisp folder he slid across the white linen tablecloth, claiming he wanted to help build my financial future. I stated for the record that he utilized my pristine credit history to secure the capital because his own assets were over-leveraged. I forced him to look at me while I named his crime. He had coerced my signature, making me the primary corporate guarantor for a shell company I did not control. He thought this strategy was brilliant. He calculated that when the bank initiated collection procedures, they would bypass his empty holding company and target my accounts. He intended to let the commercial lenders drain my newly acquired vice president's salary, leaving me financially paralyzed and dependent on his occasional charity. He failed to anticipate the legal doctrine of subrogation. Elias Trent leaned forward, taking control of the legal narrative. The senior litigator explained that under state commercial statutes, a defrauded guarantor possesses the right to absorb the defaulted note. Elias stated that I had utilized my executive compensation package to legally purchase the debt from the primary lender. I was no longer the victim of his financial trap. I was the new owner of his commercial liability. Elias instructed my father to turn to the third page of the packet. Richard flipped the heavy paper. His eyes scanned the text, and a low, strangled sound escaped his throat. I explained the consequences of his default. When he established the credit line, he was required to pledge a physical asset to secure the capital. He chose the most valuable piece of real estate in his portfolio. I pointed to the printed address on the document, the historic Beacon Hill brownstone, the crown jewel of their aristocratic identity. The document he was holding was a formal notice of intent to foreclose. I delivered the final ultimatum. The terms were non-negotiable. Richard had exactly 24 hours to liquidate his protected retirement portfolios. He was required to wire the full principal balance, plus all accrued penalty fees, into an escrow account managed by Elias Trent. Once the funds cleared, my name would be permanently removed from the guarantor registry. If the wire transfer failed to post by 9 o'clock the following morning, Elias would file the seizure orders with the municipal court. The county sheriff would arrive at the Beacon Hill brownstone to execute the eviction. They would lose the property, their social standing, and their manufactured legacy. The silence that followed this declaration was fragile, stretching thin, until it finally snapped. The unified front of the Milcah family imploded right in front of me. Toxic loyalty is a conditional alliance. It requires a shared scapegoat to function. For 29 years, I had served as the designated target, absorbing their collective venom. Now that I was untouchable, their predatory instincts turned inward. They began to cannibalize each other. Patricia shattered the quiet. She stood up, her ergonomic chair rolling backward and hitting the glass wall. She shrieked at Richard, her voice echoing harshly in the boardroom. She demanded to know if he had truly pledged their primary residence as collateral for a commercial loan without her knowledge. She accused him of risking her security, her social status, and her home for a reckless business venture. She pointed a trembling finger at his face, calling him a profound failure who had jeopardized everything she had spent decades building. Richard did not absorb the criticism. He lashed out, transferring the blame to the nearest available target. He turned his fury on Vanessa. He threw the foreclosure notice onto the table. He roared at his youngest daughter, blaming her endless vanity for draining his financial reserves. He cited the exorbitant cost of her seaport apartment, the endless stream of designer packages arriving at their door, and the lavish vacations she demanded to maintain her online persona. He declared her influencer career a pathetic delusion that had bankrupted their family. He called her a parasite who had bled him dry. Vanessa recoiled, shrinking away from his verbal assault. The carefully curated mask of the brave victim dissolved. Real tears spilled down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She sobbed, defending herself, claiming Richard had encouraged her lifestyle because he liked bragging to his country club friends about her internet fame. She screamed that they had promised to support her, and it was not her fault he was a terrible businessman. The screaming match escalated, transforming the sleek executive boardroom into a chaotic arena of mutual destruction. Patricia cried about impending poverty. Richard bellowed about ungrateful children. Vanessa wailed over her lost financial sponsor. I sat perfectly still, watching the empire burn. I did not raise my voice to quiet them. I did not offer a compromise or a sympathetic ear. I simply observed the inevitable outcome of a system built on deceit and exploitation. When you remove the foundational pillar of a corrupted structure, the collapse is swift and unforgiving. Elias sat beside me, his face impassive, tapping his silver pen against his legal pad. He was accustomed to the messy aftermath of corporate executions. He checked his stainless steel watch, calculating the remaining time. I reached across the mahogany table and retrieved my dark leather portfolio. I closed the cover, leaving the notice of foreclosure, the medical bill, and the extortion contract sitting in the center of the wood. The documents represented the hard, empirical boundaries they could no longer cross. I stood up, smoothing the lapels of my tailored navy suit. I informed them the mediation had concluded. I advised Richard to contact his wealth manager immediately, as bank transfers of that magnitude require time to process. I turned and walked toward the frosted glass doors, leaving them to drown in the toxic waters they had spent a lifetime filling. The trap had sprung flawlessly, but the true reality of their new existence had yet to settle. The next 24 hours would force them to execute the humiliating terms of their surrender, and the echoes of this boardroom confrontation would reshape their lives forever. I walked out of the executive boardroom, leaving my family to navigate the wreckage of their own design. Elias Trent remained behind to oversee the administrative execution of the ultimatum. The next 24 hours operated with the cold precision of a well-oiled machine. I did not receive any frantic phone calls begging for mercy. I did not receive any threatening text messages. When you remove the emotional oxygen from a toxic dynamic, the fire extinguishes itself rapidly. They were suffocating under the weight of empirical data and impending legal ruin. At 8 o'clock the following morning, a new digital upload appeared on Vanessa's social media feed. It was not a curated masterpiece. The video possessed none of the slick, overproduced quality that defined her influencer persona. She sat in the stark, harsh lighting of her seaport apartment. No warm ring light softened her features. No expensive filters altered her complexion. She wore a plain, gray, hooded sweatshirt. Her face was bare, revealing the deep, dark circles under her eyes. She looked directly into the camera lens and read from a printed script Elias had drafted. Her voice lacked its signature breathy whisper. It was flat monotone and utterly defeated. She stated her legal name and admitted that her previous statements regarding the hospital visit were entirely fabricated. She confessed to experiencing a minor panic attack and attempting to weaponize public sympathy against her sister and a designated medical professional. She formally retracted all allegations of abuse and neglect. She ended the video by issuing a stilted, legally mandated apology to Mass General Hospital and my biotech firm. The internet response was swift and merciless. Her followers felt deeply betrayed by the deception. The comments section, which had previously championed her as a brave victim, transformed into a digital firing squad. Users dissected her apology, calling out the lack of genuine remorse. Brands terminated her affiliate links within hours, issuing public statements distancing themselves from her platform. The algorithm that once elevated her to local fame buried her profile under an avalanche of negative reports. Her influencer career disintegrated before noon. A month later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she surrendered the lease on her luxury apartment. Without my father subsidizing her rent, she could not afford to live in the Seaport District. She took a job working the register at a mid-level retail clothing store in a suburban shopping mall. The girl who once dined on expensive sushi and wore imported silk was now folding polyester sweaters for minimum wage, dealing with angry customers, and adhering to a strict corporate time clock. The harsh reality of earning a living shattered her curated illusion. Richard met the financial deadline with only 12 minutes to spare. Elias sent me a brief encrypted email confirming the wire transfer had cleared the escrow account. The debt was settled, and my name was legally severed from the fraudulent guarantor registry. But the cost of that wire transfer drained the lifeblood from my father's empire. He was forced to liquidate his protected retirement portfolios, triggering devastating early withdrawal penalties and steep capital gains taxes. The sudden outflow of liquid cash left him critically exposed. In the insular world of Boston real estate, rumors travel faster than fiber optics. His country club associates noticed his sudden absence from high-stakes charity auctions. Whispers of his liquidity crisis infected his professional network. Commercial bankers stopped returning his phone calls, viewing his portfolio as a toxic asset. To avoid declaring total bankruptcy, Richard and Patricia were forced to put the Beacon Hill brownstone on the open market. They could not afford to wait for a premium buyer. They sold the historic property at a steep discount to a young technology developer who planned to gut the antique interior. I drove past the street weeks later and saw the moving trucks idling in the snow. Patricia was carrying cardboard boxes out the front door. She looked diminished, stripped of the aristocratic aura she once wore like a protective shield. She was forced to pack up the curated antiques and expensive artwork she valued more than her own children. They moved out of the city proper, relocating to a cramped two-bedroom rental apartment in a distant western suburb. The loss of their prestigious zip code equated to social death. They were effectively exiled from the elite society they worshipped, shunned by the very people they had spent decades trying to impress. While my family packed their belongings into rented trucks, I secured my professional future. I requested a secondary meeting with Marcus Thorne and Elena Rostova. I returned to the same executive suite where they had issued my 48-hour ultimatum. I did not sit in the subordinate chair at the center of the table. I stood at the head of the boardroom and connected my digital tablet to the wall monitor. I played Vanessa's unedited retraction video. The stark confession echoed through the room, dismantling the scandal frame by frame. I handed Elena a certified copy of the hospital discharge paperwork, highlighting the factitious presentation diagnosis. I slid a signed affidavit from Elias Trent across the wood, confirming the digital defamation was a retaliatory act of extortion stemming from a severed financial relationship. Marcus reviewed the legal documents in silence. He folded his hands and stated that Human Resources considered the matter officially resolved. He apologized for the aggressive nature of the initial inquiry, noting that the company was legally obligated to protect its shareholders from negative market fluctuations. I accepted his apology with a brief nod. I understood the nature of corporate self-preservation. I did not take their initial threat personally because I recognized it as a standard logistical protocol. By treating the crisis as a data problem rather than an emotional betrayal, I had proven my capacity for high-level executive leadership. Aini expressed her admiration for my swift handling of the liability, signaling a subtle shift in the power dynamic. I was no longer a new manager fighting to keep my title. I was an undeniable asset. I walked out of that room carrying genuine, unshakable authority. I returned to my corner office and finally unpacked the single cardboard box sitting on my mahogany desk. I placed the framed photograph of Julian and me right next to my computer monitor. I arranged my reference books and plugged in my brass desk lamp. The sweeping view of the Boston harbor stretched out before me, glittering in the winter sun. The ensuing months passed with remarkable quiet. I did not receive any holiday cards from the suburban rental apartment. I did not see any new social media posts from a mall kiosk. The silence was not heavy or oppressive. It was the clear, resonant quiet of a space that has been thoroughly cleansed. The echoes of consequence had finished reverberating, leaving a solid, stable foundation in their wake. I focused on optimizing global shipping routes, increasing company margins, and building a life anchored in truth. As the season cycled back toward winter, the city prepared for another deep freeze, but I no longer feared the cold. A full calendar cycle concluded, replacing the memory of chaos with the steady rhythm of a well-engineered life. The Massachusetts winter returned to Kendall Square, bringing familiar gray skies and biting winds that whipped across the frozen Charles River. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, watching the snow begin to fall. The date on my digital desktop calendar read November 26th. It was exactly 1 year since the hollow dinner in Beacon Hill. I did not spend the anniversary reflecting on the trauma. I spent the morning finalizing the logistics for a complex European distribution network. I directed the optimization of cold chain storage protocols, ensuring temperature-sensitive cellular therapies reached clinical trials in Munich and Paris without a single variable shifting out of place. Marcus Thorne and Elena Rostova attended the final briefing. They did not issue ultimatums or monitor my public relations exposure. They reviewed my data, nodded in approval, and treated me as an equal partner in the executive suite. I had transformed a moment of severe corporate peril into a foundation of undeniable professional authority. I closed my laptop and packed my leather briefcase. I was leaving the office early on a Friday afternoon. The work was finished, the supply chains were secure, and I had an appointment to keep in the historic center of the city. I drove away from the sleek glass towers of Cambridge and crossed the bridge into the Back Bay. The destination was a private 19th century library hidden among the traditional brick facades of the neighborhood. Julian and I had chosen the venue for its enduring architecture and quiet dignity. It was a space dedicated to the preservation of facts, history, and quiet contemplation. It was the exact opposite of the performative stages my parents favored for their social exhibitions. The interior of the library smelled of old paper, polished mahogany, and winter pine. The lighting was warm and deliberate, casting a soft glow over the vaulted ceilings and the towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. I stepped into a private reading room reserved for the bridal preparations. There were no frantic bridesmaids adjusting my hemline. There was no overbearing mother criticizing the floral arrangements or demanding the photographer capture her optimal angles. I stood in front of a tall, gilded mirror. I wore a simple, elegant gown with clean structural lines. The fabric fell flawlessly, requiring no endless adjustments. I felt a profound sense of calm. The timeline for the evening was precise, unhurried, and entirely under my control. I walked out to the upper balcony and looked down at the main reading room where the ceremony would take place. The guest list was deliberately small, encompassing fewer than 50 people. Every single chair was occupied by someone who had earned their place in our lives. My colleagues from the biotech firm sat near the front, exchanging quiet, intelligent conversation. Julian's fellow trauma surgeons and hospital administrators filled the remaining rows. They were professionals who operated in the realm of empirical truth, dedicating their lives to saving others and building functional systems. I looked at the empty spaces where biological family usually gathers. The front row on the left side of the aisle was not reserved for Richard, Patricia, or Vanessa. There were no empty seats left in silent tribute. We simply arranged the chairs to accommodate the people who were actually present. The absence of my family did not feel like a void. It felt like a meticulously cleared workspace. Over the past 12 months, they had made a few scattered attempts to breach the perimeter. During the summer, an unknown number sent a lengthy text message to my personal phone. The syntax and the fragile tone indicated it was Vanessa, likely asking for financial assistance or attempting to leverage guilt to secure a new apartment lease. I did not read past the first sentence. I pressed the delete button and blocked the number without a second thought. A boundary is only effective if you enforce it with clinical consistency. The string quartet positioned near the grand fireplace began to play a slow, resonant melody. The low notes of the cello echoed beautifully against the ancient books. I walked down the curved wooden staircase entering the main room. The faces turned toward me, reflecting genuine warmth and authentic joy. There was no underlying current of jealousy, no hidden agendas, and no toxic competition for the spotlight. Julian stood at the end of the short aisle. He had traded his navy surgical scrubs for a sharp, tailored tuxedo. The severe clinical focus he maintained in the trauma ward was replaced by a deep, quiet tenderness. He watched me approach, his dark eyes tracking my every step. The man who had effortlessly dismantled my father's arrogance and debunked my sister's fabricated medical crisis was waiting to build a permanent alliance with me. We stood together in front of the ornate stone fireplace. The ceremony was brief and stripped of unnecessary theatrics. We did not recite dramatic poetry or make unrealistic promises. We exchanged vows grounded in the reality we had forged together. We promised mutual respect, unyielding partnership, and the shared defense of the life we were building. When Julian placed the simple gold band on my finger, the metal felt solid and permanent. It was a tangible metric of a promise that would not fracture under pressure. The reception that followed was a seamless extension of the ceremony. The catering was flawless, the conversation was engaging, and the atmosphere remained peaceful. We did not have to navigate passive-aggressive toasts or manage spontaneous emotional outbursts. We dined, we danced, and we celebrated our victory over the chaos that once threatened to consume us. As the evening drew to a close, Julian and I prepared to leave the library. We said our goodbyes to the colleagues and friends who had witnessed our commitment. We retrieved our winter coats and walked toward the heavy oak doors at the front entrance. Julian pushed the doors open, and we stepped out onto Dartmouth Street. The winter storm had intensified during the reception. The sky was a deep, endless black, releasing a steady cascade of fresh, white snow. The flakes gathered on the wrought iron street lamps and blanketed the historic sidewalks. The freezing winter wind hit my face instantly. I stopped on the top step and closed my eyes, allowing the physical sensation to wash over me. 1 year ago, I stood in a snowstorm just like this one. I was shivering in a driveway locked out of a luxury SUV, reduced to a disposable courier tasked with fetching an insurance card. The cold that night was a physical manifestation of my isolation. It felt cruel, biting, and designed to punish me for existing outside the perimeter of their favor. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the chilled air into my lungs. The temperature was identical, but the context had irrevocably shifted. I opened my eyes and looked at the pristine snow covering the Boston streets. Julian stepped close beside me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. His presence was a steady anchor, radiating quiet heat against the winter chill. The cold was just weather now. It possessed no emotional weight. It did not signify rejection or familial abandonment. It felt crisp, clean, and clarifying. It was the perfect environment for a mind trained to recognize patterns and optimize outcomes. I did not need to seek warmth from a toxic source because I had learned how to generate my own. I had audited the corrupted systems of my past, identified the fatal flaws, and severed the connections. I stepped down onto the snowy pavement, my boots leaving fresh, undisturbed tracks. I left the heavy burden of the Milcah family legacy locked away in the past where it belonged. My parents could keep their faded social standing, their cramped suburban rental, and their endless cycle of mutual blame. I had walked away with the only asset that actually mattered. I understood that true inheritance is not measured by real estate portfolios, trust funds, or the illusion of elite status. My true inheritance was the unwavering courage to draw a definitive line in the snow and the logistical precision to ensure no one ever crossed it again.
We all carry a picture in our minds of what a family should look like. In the American imagination, the family is the bedrock of society, a warm hearth against the cold winters of the world, where traditional values are passed down from one generation to the next like precious heirlooms.
We are taught that the home is where we learn fairness, duty, and unconditional love.
But what happens when that hearth is built on a foundation of illusion? What happens when the values we claim to uphold, honesty, accountability, and mutual respect, are merely masks worn to maintain a flawless societal facade? The story of Sophronia Milcah is not just a gripping saga of corporate strategy and medical drama. It serves as a powerful cautionary tale for American parents regarding family dynamics, the dangers of favoritism, and the true meaning of family values in a modern professional society. It asks us to look deeply at the children we are raising and the legacies we are truly leaving behind. Every parent wants to believe they love their children equally, but actions often speak a louder, more devastating truth. A central tragic theme in Sophronia's story is the toxic dynamic of the golden child syndrome. Richard and Patricia, obsessed with status and appearances, consistently prioritized the theatrical, demanding life of their younger daughter Vanessa over Sophronia's quiet, steadfast achievements. Imagine the quiet heartbreak of reaching a monumental life milestone, a grueling, hard-earned $180,000 promotion to Vice President of Logistics, only to have your parents instantly brush it off to focus on your sister's superficial milestones. This kind of favoritism breeds a deep, silent resentment. It alienates the high-achieving child, teaching them that their worth is conditional, while simultaneously crippling the favored child by rewarding their manipulation. True family education must celebrate the unique merits of each child, rather than using one to subsidize the fragile ego or lifestyle of another. When parents fail to distribute their pride fairly, they plant the seeds of their family's eventual fracture. In today's digital age, American parents face a daunting, unprecedented challenge: guiding children toward lives of genuine substance in a culture increasingly obsessed with virality and superficiality. The narrative draws a stark, unforgiving contrast between lives built on hard work and expertise, seen in Sophronia's logistical brilliance and Julian's rigorous medical career, and a life built on optics and digital manipulation, as embodied by Vanessa's hollow influencer aspirations. When Vanessa utilized digital defamation and faked a medical emergency to garner attention, she was simply playing out the lessons her parents had implicitly taught her, that appearance matters more than truth. Parenting today must focus on building the virtues of prudence and sensitivity, the very meaning of the name Sophronia. If we reward attention-seeking behavior that lacks a foundation of integrity, we set our children adrift in a world where they have no real anchor. We must teach them that true success is found in the quiet, unglamorous hours of dedication, not in the fleeting applause of a digital audience. Furthermore, we often hear the phrase, traditional family values, but these words are entirely meaningless without the bedrock of honesty and accountability. Richard and Patricia likely viewed themselves as the pinnacle of the Boston elite, projecting an image of aristocratic perfection and traditional success. Yet beneath the tailored suits and the Beacon Hill address, their actions were rooted in profound deception and financial fraud. Richard's betrayal was not just emotional, it was a devastating breach of paternal duty. He coerced Sophronia into signing documents that made her the financial guarantor for Vanessa's debts, effectively betraying his older daughter's trust to fund a shell company. Educating children within the home must go far beyond teaching them how to present themselves to the world. It requires teaching them to respect the boundaries and legal rights of others, starting within the family unit itself. A parental legacy built on deceit is a house of cards waiting for the wind. Perhaps the most difficult, yet vital duty of a parent is allowing a child to face the consequences of their own actions. We instinctively want to shield our children from pain, but Richard and Patricia's relentless shielding of Vanessa was a profound, lifelong disservice. The story's climax, a financial checkmate where the parents lose their status and their home, is a direct result of their own lack of foresight and ethics. Because they insulated Vanessa from reality, she was utterly unprepared for the world. When her digital stunt failed under the scrutiny of professional truth, she was forced to take a minimum-wage job, her curated illusions finally shattered. If we want to properly orient a child's future, parents must allow them to face the consequences of their actions. Shielding a child from reality only ensures their eventual, catastrophic failure when they are finally forced to step into professional environments that demand true, high intellectual standards and professional authority. What then is the ultimate inheritance we leave our children? For Sophronia, her true inheritance was not family money, a prestigious name, or a Beacon Hill estate. It was the hard-won, painful ability to set firm boundaries. To thrive in her career, her marriage, and her own soul, she had to completely block the family that had betrayed her. There is a haunting lesson here for all of us raising the next generation. If you want to be a part of your children's future, you must treat them with respect in the present. If you abandon them during the blizzard of their lives, prioritizing your own comfort or a favored sibling's demands, you will surely find yourself uninvited to the spring of their ultimate success. By focusing on merit, integrity, and mutual respect, parents can ensure they are building a legacy that lasts, rather than one that collapses under the weight of its own deceit. Stories like these remind us of the fragile, beautiful, and sometimes dangerous nature of family bonds. They hold up a mirror to our own lives, asking us to evaluate the foundations upon which we build our homes. If you find yourself captivated by narratives that explore the deep, hidden truths of human relationships, family dynamics, and the pursuit of justice, please take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel Sophia Told Stories. We dive into these complex, emotional journeys together to find the lessons that help us navigate our own lives. As we look back at the snow settling over a quiet New England winter, we are left to ponder our own reflections. Every day, at our own dinner tables, we are laying the bricks of our children's futures. Are we building monuments of truth, or are we constructing fragile facades? When the inevitable storms of life hit, what will remain standing? Perhaps the most terrifying and beautiful truth about parenting is that we do not just raise children. We raise the adults who will one day hold the power to either welcome us into the warmth of their lives or leave us standing out in the cold. The choice of which story we are writing is happening right now, in the quiet moments we think no one is watching.